I had always dreamed of a life away from the noise and chaos of the city. The sudden loss of my job and the end of my 3-year relationship pushed me to make that dream a reality, though not in the way I'd imagined. The breakup had been brutal, leaving me hollowed out and numb, and losing my job felt like the final nail in the coffin. I needed a break, somewhere far away, somewhere quiet. I found the cabin through an online listing. It was described simply, secluded cabin for rent, great for retreats or extended stays, no neighbors for miles. It sounded perfect. Nestled deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, the cabin promised peace, solitude, and a much-needed escape from everything I wanted to leave behind. The drive to the cabin was uneventful. As I neared the property, the road narrowed, twisting through dense trees that loomed on both sides. There was no cell service out here. The GPS had cut out over an hour ago, but the directions were easy to follow. When I finally arrived, the cabin stood before me, its old wooden frame weathered by time but still sturdy. It looked like no one had lived here in years. Moss clung to the walls and ivy had overtaken the surrounding trees, almost as if the forest were slowly swallowing it. I breathed in the fresh air and smiled. This was what I needed. No distractions, no people, just quiet. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The interior was rustic but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a wooden table, a living area with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. A narrow hallway led to a basement door at the back, but I didn't bother investigating. The main floor was enough for me. I was here to relax. The first day passed in a blur of sleep and light unpacking. Exhausted from the drive and everything that had brought me here, I collapsed into bed early, letting the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of peace. That peace didn't last. On the second night, things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, an unusual silence that blanketed the cabin. Even though the forest should have been full of life, there was no sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me. I hadn't fully adjusted to the isolation yet, and it was probably nothing. I tossed and turned, pulling the blanket tighter around myself, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind buzzed with anxiety, and my thoughts drifted back to the cabin's oddities, especially the strange markings I had noticed earlier. They were faint, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Scratched into the wooden beams near the windows and around the door frames, the markings looked like symbols, crude, jagged lines that vaguely resembled eyes. At the time, I had dismissed them as graffiti left by previous occupants. But now, lying awake in bed, the memory of those marks gnawed at me. Why had I only seen them by the windows? And why hadn't anyone tried to clean them off? A soft sound broke through my thoughts. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound came again, this time clearer. A faint creaking, like the sound of wood bending under weight. It was coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, wincing as the cold air hit me, and crept to the window. I peered out into the dark forest, my breath fogging the glass. The trees stood like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the ground. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it. Standing just at the edge of the trees, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure. At first I thought it was a person, someone who had wandered too far into the woods. But something about the figure was wrong. It didn't move, didn't shift or sway like a normal person would. It just stood there, staring at the cabin, or rather, at me. My throat tightened. My first instinct was to fling the window open and shout at the figure, demand to know what they were doing. But something held me back. There was a coldness in the air, a sense of dread that coiled in my gut. Every instinct screamed at me not to make a sound. For what felt like an eternity, I remained frozen at the window, my breath shallow as I watched the figure. It didn't budge. It just stood there, as still as the trees around it. And then, without warning, it was gone. One moment, it was there, and the next, the space where it stood was empty. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. Had it been real? Or had my mind conjured it out of fatigue and stress? I stood at the window for a long time, waiting for any sign of movement, any sound that would explain what I had just seen. But there was nothing, just the silent forest stretching out into the night. Shaking my head, I pulled the curtain shut and climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of that figure standing at the edge of the woods, its faceless silhouette burned into my memory. Morning came too soon, and the unease from the night before lingered. I spent the day trying to distract myself, throwing myself into cleaning the cabin, organizing my belongings, anything to keep my mind busy. The cabin wasn't in bad shape, but it was clear that no one had lived here in a while. Dust clung to the corners, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling beams like forgotten memories. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to the figure. Was it just a random hikir who had gotten lost? Or maybe some kind of animal that my mind had mistaken for a person? Either way, it didn't make sense. The area was too remote for casual wanderers, and even if someone had been out there, why would they just stand there and watch? By afternoon, I decided to investigate the property more thoroughly. I ventured outside, walking the perimeter of the cabin. The trees pressed in from all sides, making the space feel smaller than it was. I found no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there the night before. As I approached the back of the cabin, my eyes landed on the basement door. I hadn't thought much about it when I arrived. Basements in old cabins were typically damp, filled with storage and forgotten junk. But now, standing in front of it, a strange sense of foreboding washed over me. The door was locked. I tried to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach as I returned to the cabin. The figure in the woods, the strange silence, the locked basement, it was all just coincidence. I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something had been watching me, and it wasn't finished. The third night was worse. I had hoped the figure I saw was a one-time thing, just a product of my frayed nerves, but deep down, I knew better. I tried to distract myself again during the day, hiking through the woods surrounding the cabin and attempting to clear my head. But the woods felt wrong too. Dense, suffocating, as if the trees themselves were watching me. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made me glance over my shoulder. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Inside, the air felt thick, like the walls were pressing in on me. I busied myself with making dinner, trying not to think about the basement door or the figure outside. I hadn't touched the door since I discovered it was locked. In truth, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was down there. There was something about the cabin, its strange silence, the marks on the walls, and the eerie figure outside, that made me feel like I was trespassing, even though I had paid to be here. As night fell, the oppressive quiet settled over the forest again. I sat on the couch, staring at the fire crackling in the fireplace, trying to keep my thoughts focused. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was too absolute, too unnatural. Every minute that passed felt like something was creeping closer, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. The whispering started just before midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low murmur coming from the walls. But as I strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Words in a language I couldn't understand, hissing through the walls like a distant conversation just out of reach. My blood ran cold. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin, near the basement door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The whispers continued, a steady hum of incomprehensible words that set my teeth on edge. Suddenly, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment I didn't dare move. I stood frozen in place, my pulse thundering in my ears. Slowly, I backed away from the door and returned to the living room, forcing myself to sit back down. My hands were shaking. Something was wrong with this place. The figure in the woods, the strange symbols scratched into the walls, the locked basement, and now the whispering. It was all connected. But connected to what? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in the cabin wasn't just in my head. I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. If I was going to stay here, I had to know what was going on. My thoughts returned to the locked basement door. Whatever secrets this cabin held, they were down there. Determined, I grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the door. I didn't want to damage the property, but the sense of urgency gnawed at me. I couldn't stay another night in this place without knowing what was beneath it. The lock was old and rusted, but after a few minutes of prying, it gave way with a metallic snap. The door creaked open, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading into darkness. A foul, musty odor wafted up, as if the air down there hadn't been disturbed in years. I hesitated, then flicked on the flashlight from my phone and began my descent. The basement was small, with low ceilings and unfinished walls. The beams supporting the cabin above were rough and uneven, and the floor was dirt, damp beneath my feet. The room itself was almost empty, just a few old rotting crates stacked in one corner, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. But what immediately caught my attention were the markings on the walls. The same symbols I had seen near the windows upstairs were etched into the basement walls, only here they were much larger, more intricate. The crude eye-like shapes stared at me from every corner, their jagged lines cutting deep into the wood. In the center of the far wall was something different, an image carved into the wood with painstaking detail. It depicted a figure standing in a forest surrounded by tall trees. The figure had no face, just an empty void where its features should have been. Surrounding it were more of the strange symbols, arranged in a pattern that made my head spin if I stared too long. My eyes were drawn to something resting on a dusty table beneath the carving. It was a journal, the cover cracked and faded with age. I reached for it, hesitating only briefly before opening it to the first page. The journal belonged to the cabin's previous owner, a man named Thomas Werner. As I skimmed through the pages, I realized he had become obsessed with something he referred to as the Silent Watcher. The entries started innocuously enough. Werner had rented the cabin for the same reasons I had, looking for peace and solitude. But things had quickly taken a dark turn. Werner described the same feelings of being watched, the same strange symbols around the cabin. But he had gone further. He had researched the symbols, finding references to ancient rituals and entities that were said to inhabit the deep woods, creatures that lived in the spaces between reality and nightmare. The Silent Watcher, according to Werner, was one of them, a malevolent force that preyed on those who dared to notice it. Once you saw it, once you acknowledged its presence, it was already too late. My stomach churned as I read on. The journal detailed how Werner had become consumed by his fear of the Watcher. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it invaded his mind, just like it was invading mine. He wrote about the figure standing at the edge of the woods, always watching but never approaching. Werner had attempted to escape, but every time he left the cabin, the Watcher seemed to follow him, appearing closer each time. He wrote of sleepless nights, whispers in the walls, and finally hallucinations, visions of the Watcher breaking through reality, warping the world around him. The last entry was short, scrawled in the shaky handwriting. The Watcher won't let me leave. It's too late now. I can feel it inside my mind. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I stumbled back from the table, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The Watcher wasn't just some figment of Werner's imagination. It was real, and it was here, watching me. I had to leave. Now. I turned to rush back upstairs, but froze. Standing at the top of the staircase, bathed in the dim light filtering down from the cabin, was the figure. It hadn't moved. It didn't speak. It didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, blocking the only exit, its faceless head tilted slightly, as if considering me. Panic surged through my veins. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't move. The figure didn't need to chase me. It was already inside my head, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every second. For what felt like hours, I stood there, frozen, my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move, didn't blink, if it even could. Then finally, as though satisfied that I wasn't going anywhere, it turned and walked slowly back up the stairs. My legs gave out. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. What the hell was happening? I didn't want to stay here anymore. I couldn't. But where could I go? The Watcher wasn't bound to the cabin. It followed Werner everywhere, and now it was following me. I needed to figure out how to stop it. I spent the rest of the day scouring the journal for any hint of how Werner had dealt with the Watcher, but there was little hope in his writing. Werner had tried rituals, prayers, even offerings, Nothing worked. His final attempt had been to set fire to the cabin itself, believing that destroying the place where the Watcher first appeared would sever its hold on him. But Werner's final entry implied that even that had failed. I didn't have any other options. As night fell, I gathered whatever matches and kindling I could find. If Werner had been right about the fire, I had to try. It was my only chance. But as I struck the match and dropped it onto the kindling, the figure appeared again. This time, it was closer. Not at the edge of the woods, but at the window, staring in. The flames crackled, but I could already tell it wasn't enough. The Watcher didn't flinch. It didn't move. It stood there, watching as the flames grew brighter, as if daring me to believe it could be stopped. My head pounded, my vision blurred. I stumbled back from the fire, feeling the walls of the cabin close in around me. It was like reality itself was distorting, bending, cracking under the weight of the Watcher's presence. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with a life of their own. The Watcher stepped through the door. The flames didn't even touch it. For a long, agonizing moment, I stood there, paralyzed with fear. The fire should have destroyed the cabin, burned the place down, but it didn't even matter. The Watcher moved through the flames like they weren't there. Its faceless form advanced on me, each step slow and deliberate. The room warped, stretched, like it was breaking apart. I backed into the far corner, but there was nowhere to go. My mind felt like it was splitting in two, unraveling under the pressure. The Watcher was inside me now, clawing at my thoughts, feeding on my terror. Everything around me bent and twisted in impossible ways. The walls melted, the floor cracked, and the air itself seemed to buzz with unnatural energy. There was no escape. Suddenly I heard a voice, a soft whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a language I could understand, but the meaning was clear enough. You're mine. The Watcher's presence overwhelmed me, crushing the last shred of resistance I had left. The world around me blurred into darkness as my mind broke completely. When I woke up, the world felt wrong. I was lying on the floor of the cabin, staring up at the ceiling beams. The smell of smoke hung in the air, but the fire was gone. Everything looked the same, the furniture, the symbols on the walls, but the air was thick with an unseen presence. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. I had to leave. I had to get out before the Watcher took me for good. Without even thinking, I bolted out the door into the forest. The trees closed in on me, but I didn't care. I just ran, not knowing where I was going, just hoping to escape. But no matter how far I went, the feeling never left. The Watcher was still there, always just at the edge of my vision, watching. It's still watching. It always will be.